cherished listeners of the Acid Horizon podcast. It's Craig, your host. And if you are tuning in during May 2024, this episode's intro brings you both timely updates for this month and some of the usual timeless tidbits as well. In fact, you might hear this same intro on 2 May episodes because, well, we try to be anti-work sometimes around here. But anyway, on Thursday, May 30th, join Acid Horizon's current crew, Will, Adam, myself, and Noah, who appears on the show from time to time, at Pete's Candy Store in Brooklyn, New York at 7 p.m. We're hosting a live event centered around Anti-Oculus, a philosophy of escape out on Repeater Books. And you can expect a blend of reflection and some forward thinking regarding our work. And it is, of course, just a great excuse to hang out with friends and comrades. So consider this your official invitation, but keep in mind that space is limited. So plan ahead. Details about the event will be in the show notes. Just follow the links wherever you're tuning in from. Now, on to more heartfelt matters. As May 2024 marks the 4-year anniversary of Acid Horizon, we want to extend our deepest gratitude to the ever-expanding network of interesting and compassionate friends and comrades we've met along this journey. Your support means the world to us. If you're interested in joining our reading groups or staying updated on all things within our community, consider subscribing to our Patreon. While paid supporters gain immediate access to our reading groups, know that we're here for you even in tough times. Just shoot us a DM and we'll ensure that you're included in our shared learning spaces. And if you're feeling particularly generous or find yourself somehow spontaneously brimming over with surplus cash, consider supporting us at the $5, the $10, or the $25 level. Your contributions not only help us thrive, but also spare you from those obnoxious ads that infiltrate other podcast feeds. Regardless of how you choose to support us, know that we are immensely grateful for any and all contribution to our collective. Now, let's dive into the conversation. All right, here we are, late night, Acid Horizon. So yes, this is another informal discussion with our friend, The Stranger, who joins us to go over a number of proposed topics, maybe one of them, maybe some that we did not propose at all. And we also have Will in tow in our late night session. There was actually a lot of people who reached out to me and said, bring The Stranger back on the show. We really love the pacing of that discussion. We love the openness. And, sometimes when we're dealing with the books like Deleuze or Agamben and stuff, we want to be fairly systematic in going through arguments and make it worth people's while to listen to that sort of thing. So it requires us to take on a different tone and adopt a different sort of discourse. But now we're going to relax. The suspenders are now dropped down around our waist, just like the reception here at a wedding. Welcome back, Stranger. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me back. And I always enjoy the conversations. I feel like I learned something, and I'm glad other people like listening to them. That is a little perverse, but I enjoy that aspect of it. So
this is the place to be perverse. And speaking of perversity, we have Will with us as well. Will, how you doing tonight?
As always, Craig, I'm just so happy to be here. Yeah, it's a night. It's weird to do Acid Horizon at 9 p.m. I think the last time we did this was like years ago. We did an episode on like Proust and Signs or something at like 10 p.m. But no, we did it with The Stranger super late at night back when I was living in like my sister's closet.
I'm a night owl. I like work all day, and then I do like human stuff with the fiance, and then with the dogs, and then comes the me just doing stuff I want to do time. And I guess I convinced you guys to be late night people, so appreciate it.
What's a subject of modernity without compartmentalized living is what I say. Well, with that said, what were some of the topics that we wanted to discuss? You had floated the idea of talking about becoming, I guess, broadly construed, perhaps in the context of Deleuze, but also I think that was connected to the idea of readiness in the sense of like being ready for relationships, like people who maybe are on the cusp of getting into a relationship or thinking about getting into a relationship and maybe not quite feeling like they're ready for that sort of thing. It's not just relationships. We're also thinking about any sort of event in our life, whether it be a crisis or a massive boon, things that we're not prepared for, but we find out how prepared we really are once we arrive. Is that what we kind of had in mind? That was one of the things that you had brought up.
Both you and Will, I think, tweeted or subtweeted or quote tweeted, whatever we call it these days, some post about people should have their shit together before they get in a long-term relationship. And like, it was kind of this kind of like moralistically tinged, like people need to be like really in order before they're with each other. And you guys each had your own reaction to it. And then I really liked that you brought up, kind of criticized it a little bit, because I had my own reaction to it, where whenever I do discharge planning with families from the hospital I work at, this question of readiness always comes up, and I always have this conversation. I won't go too into it if there's more setup, but of like, you're never fully ready for most of the things in life, and you only become ready by doing it when you're not ready. And it really matches with that kind of Nietzschean adage of you become who you are, which I think, gets perverted and distorted a little bit and becomes like this weird, like mystical thing. But it really just means that there is no such thing as readiness. It's like this weird Cartesian idealistic concept that we like reify, and it's not real. Like, you become ready by making a bunch of mistakes and kind of not being a great person, and then learning from mistakes. And then you come out the other side, something you couldn't imagine. And that's really materialism. So I won't get too crazy with it, but we have to live and learn.
Well, I actually say a little bit more. What's Cartesian about that?
Maybe it's not Cartesian. You guys have to call me out on my BS, but I think of like Cartesianism as like, the split between the mental realm and the physical realm, and like this metaphysical like commitment to like there's a clear ideal of what it means to be ready, and then there's a clear case of not being ready, and like that's kind of just made up. Like, show me what it means to be ready. Like, is it a pure concept, like metaphysically? Is there someone who embodies that? So I guess Cartesian for me is like a stand-in for like idealism, where we kind of talk about a concept as if it's a thing. I can give a better example. I read a lot of philosophy, but I'm pretty sloppy with it, as you guys can tell. But like, quick, super short story. So like, a kid will be in the hospital for a long time, and I'm always general with patients because I never want to, breach confidentiality or be, inappropriate or anything. But like, kids come and they want to harm themselves, or they are self-harming, or they want to commit suicide, or they tried to commit suicide. Maybe they're not eating. Any number of things that is like imminently harmful to them continuing to exist. And then in the hospital, that improves usually for a number of reasons, like the behavioral hospital, not like a medical hospital. And then comes the time to go home and try to maintain the stability we've gained in the hospital at home. Parents get anxious. Well, how do we know our child is ready? Can't 2 more weeks, won't 2 more weeks help? And then we get into that kind of epistemological like error of like when we went to the moon, how do we know the moon's not made out of cheese? Well, we dug in deep, okay, and we didn't find any cheese. And then people say, well, you just didn't dig deep enough. So somehow people always think more treatment is going to fix these issues, and that at some point we're going to get to this place of elusive readiness, and then we'll just know it when we're there. But as critical thinkers, we listen to that and we think, that doesn't sound real. There's this distant point that we're supposed to get to, but no one can tell us what it's like. And when we get there, we'll just know. That sounds like the second coming of Christ or something. So any of those kind of topics, they're not imminent. They're not in the moment. They're not in your body. They're not really real. They're just kind of these reified concepts. So the practical answer usually is more time in a hospital isn't going to help your kid not harm themselves when they go home. You guys working as a family to figure out how to act differently so your kid isn't so ostracized in the family system will, and that can only be done at home. We can't simulate the family environment here in the treatment center. We have to do that at home. Oh, but what if my kid hurts themselves? They might, and then you have to do those things we talked about rather than punish them or get mad at them or say they're a loser. So you actually have to do that. You have to be the change there, and we're not going to get that at the hospital. You're only going to get that at home. So there is no being ready. You're never ready enough to do that. You only become ready when you plunge yourself into it, and then you do it, and it's messy, but you come out the other side. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I feel strongly about that with relationships. I won't go into that right now, but I wonder what you folks think.
Sure, of course, Craig is going to be like, "Oh, relationships will like we'll put the 27-year-old on." Yeah, no,
I'm
fair.
also talking about
Put my ass on
psychiatry, which
blast
you have a
here.
lot of thoughts, I think, on a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, so I think one of the things about readiness as it pertains to romantic relationships and to this elusive thing that this art that we call love is one of the things that's increasingly lost as psychiatric power becomes generalized and then sort of dissipated into like the way in which we talk to each other, talk about ourselves, understand one another, is that it establishes a series of sort of necessary conditions that need to be met. And then if one meets those conditions, then one can therefore be capable of XYZ relation. That is not love, that's just discipline. That's making a good soldier or like a good nurse. That is not how one, say, deals with their family or deals with their lover in any sort of case at all. Love is a kind of intimacy where the game between particularity and generality doesn't really function anymore, right? So we can say, you don't just love your boyfriend because he has blonde hair and pretty eyes or something like that, right? But you also can't just say, "Oh, I just love my boyfriend because I'm in love," and you know, um, it's a question of distance and relation, right? And if that if the possibility of that ethical relationship, of that art of existence, is already predicated or met with a series of demands that are often always mediated by the contemporary mode of production, right? So, like, she needs to be, self-sufficient. She needs to be independent. She needs to make this kind of money. Besides often being, misogynistic, which is, of course, again mediated by a mode of production. These things fail. I mean, once love becomes a question of one's attunement to an institution, it's no longer a question of ethics, but a question of power and control. And I think that for that reason, when one says, "Oh, is one ready for a relationship?" I want to kind of flip around I sort of want to break down Deleuze's famous comment in Difference and Repetition about being worthy of the event, right? You determine your worthiness of the event. There's no retroactive, clock in chart or HR manager that's going to tell you whether or not you were worthy or are worthy of the event. Amor fati is love of your fate, your love of your fate. No one else is going to love your fate for you, and no one else can tell you whether you're ready. You determine and express your readiness to yourself all the time. And that's not to say that there's some sort of subjective interiority here at play. That's not how it works. What I want to sort of caution against is trying to understand love as an economic relation between two subjects. Because I think that's largely when this phenomenon that we've noticed, much like friendship throughout history, if it has a transcendental kernel throughout history, it's always eluded and found itself, finding its ontological importance beyond any given stricture of an institution, right? Love is always deeper than a marriage if it works, or than a title of boyfriend or girlfriend, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that for that reason, when Deleuze and Guattari say that love, the challenge of love is to love without a face. I actually want to push back and say, uh, it's not love unless it is without a face. Facialized love is, I think, always doomed to repeat the same pitfalls of trying to create, cohesiveness between subjects. Like, think about that that Bumble conference that was given the other week, where you type in to this AI assistant. This is the kind of technology that they want to produce. Your fears, your insecurities, the things you're looking for in a partner. This idea that one stumbles upon what they're looking for by specifically identifying it is an absurdity. And it's panoptic in a certain sense, right? It's isolating particular features of an individual who's always in the process of subjectivation, right? Who's always becoming something. Love is something that should completely destabilize these things, or at least make us skeptical of them. So this idea that we can set out in advance this figure of a partner, that's what the search bar on Pornhub is for. But that's not a question of that art of coexistence, or that art of being with another. And really that being with another is a perpetual kind of becoming. But that's where I'll leave it at for now. I've got other things to say, but Craig will.
I don't know what to say after the Pornhub search bar comment, but I was going to talk about The Karate Kid from the 1980s, because to me, that's like one of the sort of preeminent examples of a film that's actually about readiness or lack thereof, or the uncertainty of one's readiness, especially, at the end when Mr. Miyagi goes in and says, all right, let's sign this guy up. Which division you going into, son? And he puts him right in the black belt division. And I mean, not that that's, a sort of profound note in the history of cinema, but I mean, is The Karate Kid cinema? That's another question. But I think just that example and the sort of trepidation that he feels in the moment when his master puts him there, it sets a new bar, or sets a new expectation for one. And now you're really thrust into the event, because I think by him doing that, it subverted a sense of readiness, a sense of expectation. And I mean, I think this happens in more real and palpable and important ways in the real world. I mean, think about young people who lose older family members, and then you have the 14-year-old who essentially raises the younger brother or younger sister. There is no preparation for that. The school is on the ground in the moment, imminent, like you're saying. Going back to talking about reifying readiness, of course, there's a dual risk. Of course, we set social benchmarks so that there's some level of, some sense of strata, whether it's being an adolescent, being a young adult, or somebody who's in their middle age. We have these sort of benchmarks, and these are ways in which we can navigate our world through a semi-concretized sense of subjectivity. Of course, it comes with all of the risk that we talk about on the show all the time. These are the very things by which we are subjugated by the system that we live within. And I think we are fast approaching a world where it's hard to get ready for some of the crises that we face on the ground every day. Not here in the imperial core as much, although with climate change and so forth, these crises are ramping up. But just to bring it back to the concept of readiness in general, and to bring in Deleuze, one of our favorites here again, I often think about, too, how something like, Deleuze talks about swimming and this sort of intensive pedagogy of swimming. Like, you can teach somebody to do the backstroke, or hold their breath underwater for 45 seconds, or learn to kick their legs at the wall. But when swimming in the ocean, for example, especially if there's a little bit of current or something like that, now all of those mini blocks that you learned in the swimming lesson, it gets reduced to a kind of immediacy and a sense of intensity where you're one with the ocean. For you to be able to swim well means to be that you are integrated with your environment somehow. And that, to me, is very different than the kind of seriality that comes with the concept of readiness. Okay, we're going from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. And I think one's maturity in any given endeavor or discipline, whether you're a musician or whether you're a teacher, for example, getting your chops up to a certain point where you almost forget about the techniques, that you can get in the zone, get in the flow states. That, to me, far outstrips a sense of readiness. And often when the concept of readiness is invoked, I think what we sometimes do is we preempt or preclude those moments where maybe something like that intensity is called for. It's really our fear speaking.
I think I want to pull some like common threads from what both of you said. Like I think talking about like emergent qualities and moments. That's my understanding of like an event. It's like a unique experience that you can't really predict. I know that's not really the metaphysical way Badu and Deleuze are using it, but well, here's what I thought about. Like, we're all musicians here. We can play in our rooms and practice, but do you remember the first time you got on stage and the amp is cranked and you put your fingers to the strings and then it feels completely different because you're used to playing at like 2 in your room on your half stack, and now you're fucking playing through like massive amps on stage, and like the room is different and everything is different. You're not really ready. You're never ready to play on stage in front of other people until the moment you do it, and your fight or flight is going so much. Like, I'm sure we all remember our first show. You don't even remember getting through the set list. Like, you finish out the set list and you're like, what just happened? At least that's my first time. I played with like my grindcore kind of band back in the day. It was like, what just happened? But the moments that we avoid by thinking we're not ready are the very moments that make us ready, is what I'm trying to get at. And I'm wondering if you folks are also getting that, and you're getting at that in your own kind of language. You can't simulate or kind of make up criteria for readiness, because it's not something you can know in advance. It's something you have to experience. Wilfred Bion, he's a psychoanalyst from Britain. He's a Kantian. He coined the term, I think, learning from experience, which for him was a very Kantian understanding of how the human mind works, that we can't really know things a priori or in advance. We have to go and live it, like swimming. We can take all the lessons, but we have to go swim. We can practice music, but we have to go play on a stage. As far as relationships, I can tell a little bit of a personal story, but I'll tell that in a bit. I was essentially a loser, and I became a much better person through knowing my fiance and growing with her. So if we were looking at readiness, neither of us were ready to jump into a long-term relationship. We've been together for 11 years, but have we become ready together, growing together? Absolutely. And that's what, again, the concept of becoming, I think, means is something you can't predict or know in advance, and yet it's kind of your destiny in a non-cheesy way.
Yeah, and I think that also this question of being able to establish specific predicates in order to sort of establish oneself as being worthy of romantic engagement or being ready for any sort of thing, whether it's a friendship or one's own trajectory, or if one's seeking to engage in a form of political activity. I think that there's a kind of necessary misdirection. What I mean by that is that there's only going to ever be a certain level of certainty in any given relationship, right? And if other certainties fail, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've failed as a sort of relationship partner or something like that. And this actually hit me when I went with Coop from Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour to the MoMA together, and I was kind of going through it when I was with him. And like every single time we stopped for coffee, it was like a free therapy session for Coop. So I apologize, and I also thank you. But we came across Magritte's Lovers, the one where the two are kissing masks on, and that kind of struck me in a really different way. The whole room is set up with various Magritte paintings, and he's often considered the master of misdirection. And the misdirection is usually just very clever. This is not a pipe, or the apple supplanting identity rather than the apple being something that is consumed. But here I think that misdirection is strategic and not just witty. Like, I think that Magritte's actually giving an account of love in that painting of the kiss, because it's like without place. It's clearly an interior, but isn't necessarily, because you can see stucco lining on the top. So you get the sense that it's maybe a living room of some sort. It's in a house, perhaps, but there's also a dark exterior in the background that you can imagine is just a void. And they're completely faceless. And yet the only thing that there is kind of contact between these two people. And I can't, what Magritte does is sort of redefine the kiss as something that is a process through which one falls into someone's eyes so closely that one can no longer see them. They are known only in their intimacy as subjects in the painting. We're left as voyeurs to this moment, and we don't know who they are, and we're left at a complete and total distance. But the only thing that we know is that they share a particular distance, a very specific distance. And that distance is, of course, the kiss. And that's the only contact that they have with one another. And I think that that's a pretty remarkable account of love, that it's without face, it's without faciality, it's without place. And to bring up, Ed Casey, it's without placiality, right? Like, there doesn't have to be the warmth of the home. Love doesn't exist in some sort of process of building. A gap is sort of eliminated, but there isn't sort of an image that is left over, but one finds oneself sort of in an image. And I think that for that reason, love continues to be, at least when we talk about like philosophy, one of the most ethically challenging things to articulate. So it's left to philosophers to write 10-page essays on, or like rather half-hearted works, or overly affective accounts of the thing. But then we see love taking its form in its most institutionalized. It's taking its most institutionalized form, which is a completely desubjectivated one, where one is completely individualized. They are a series of particular health concerns, debt, mental health, hygiene, status, completely reduced to individual, a series of data. And I'm sure I sound like a grouch when I say that, like, there is something deeply nauseating about like swiping left and swiping right. I've done it, and it's there's a reason why Bumble puts an ad for if you need help, here's the helpline. And I don't think it's just because some guys and girls might not get matches, or something like that. I think that there's literally something existentially horrific about reducing a human being to basically a prison dock, and then making a determination about something that is about one's mode of life, and it's just completely out of your control, and yet you are the one making the decision to reduce. So I think that the way in which we've approached the question of love, and the way in which we've turned it into just an extension of workplace synergy, is somewhat horrifying, but I think rather par for the course. American capitalism is, as Idris Robinson says, it's allergic to love. It hates communism, and it's allergic to love.
Love cannot be optimal or efficient.
Precisely. It's not. Love can never be optimized.
Yes. And any process that tries for optimization or if maximum efficiency, is not going to work. That's basically the plot of the Matrix. Like, I know there's a lot of subplots in there, but Neo and Trinity's love is this singularity of will that just breaks the system, which I know it's like overloaded with like cliches, but it was cool in the 90s and 2000s. And but it is true. It's a love story. The Wachowski siblings say that. They say it's a love story above everything. So I think there's something interesting there.
Well, full disclosure, I met my wife online, met her 12 years ago and change now. And we matched at an 81%, whatever the fucking rating system is on, I think it was OkCupid, which goes to show you can pass with a B minus and not even just pass. You can make it 12 fucking years. One of the things that my wife and I talk about too is, I mean, we're so very different in so many ways. Maybe the story is, oh, it's just complementary. But in a way, we subverted the very striated field of online dating, which if you're in your late 20s or early 30s or mid 30s even, 40s, 50s, whoever's listening, this is all for you. It can be very daunting, especially when people use things like their interests, their bands, their favorite movies, and everything like that to sort of build an online persona that's often really hard to break through in order to get the stuff that really makes a relationship as worthwhile as it can possibly be. And going back, I think I was the one that had reached out to her. She had none of that. Like, she didn't put forward that persona. I was a band guy. I was into movies and books and stuff like that. And so, of course, I'm searching for that shit. That was a mistake. And she had none of that. But somehow, between like all of my deep Faith No More references and whatever the kind of reading I was doing at that time, she liked dogs and hiking, and like that was it. That was it. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of other stuff there. And then somehow it just worked. And so even if it fails tomorrow, it has been a success insofar as it subverted the machine.
I passed with a gentleman's C in the relationship game. Like,
Oh, I love that. Well, I really don't think readiness exists in most categories of life. Not that we can really categorize life, but you know what I mean. Readiness, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like it's a framework that can function if we all buy into it and it has internal consistency, but it's not really in the world. You're not just going to stumble upon readiness. I'm trying not to do the natural artificial distinction. I don't believe in that, but it's hard to do that in regular language. But like, I'll give another example for mental health just because it's my bias and it's my like everyday. We see these folks who are in like government custody, basically, taken away from their families. And it's because they have been violent to their parents, but there's reasons why they've been violent. Not that I agree with that, but these kids aren't just randomly violent. And you'll hear the people say, like, we'll be like, all right, it's time to send them back to home and see how they do. And everyone will point to their history and say, but in the past, they've done X and Y. And I always say, like, they're never going to do anything or be anything different than X and Y until we give them a chance. Okay, but what if they do that? Well, then they've done what we already know they're capable of, but we gave them a chance to do something other. And that's the only way people change, is if you give them the opportunity to be different. So I wonder if this resonates with both of your I don't know how to say it, anti-jail, penal system.
Abolitionism.
Yeah, like prison doesn't, it just reinforces a lot of that stuff, right? And it doesn't really teach, I'm kind of using that in block quotes, people to be different. Even if the system is fucked up, we still have to figure out how to live in it until it goes away, or how do we live in it in a way that makes it diminished. It's attached to this idea of readiness. Readiness is almost always used for conservative or reactionary type motives, even if they're not doing it on purpose. Like, these parents aren't like mean, bad, people who are against other people, but readiness is used to gatekeep and clamp down openness to new experiences and all these things that are, again, like emergent emergent. I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll ramble.
I think one of the challenges is the term itself, readiness, because it so easily lends itself to an equivocation, even in the context of a given sentence. I mean, we've been talking about it in terms of the series of thresholds established by social norms that are then either the objects of gatekeeping and so forth that we've been talking about. But it can also refer to the real metabolism of material forces in a given situation. Like, are you ready to take that punch? Well, actually, no, my face is not going to survive that humongous fist. I'm not ready because laws of physics. I think by and large, though, once we put readiness into the discourse, I think it ends up more or less referring to the first thing that we're talking about. And so, in just very simple terms, if you're saying I'm not ready for a relationship, I don't have to be on a particular cusp that's identifiable. And if there's somebody in my life who I'm vibing with, or, I have a chance meeting that night at the bagel shop or whatever the case may be, things are going to kick off. And I think, there's an unconscious factor in the sort of Deleuze-Guattarian sense of a social unconscious, in that when the stars align for two people, for example, to fall in love with one another, once those forces are in motion, if there is a burgeoning love there is not much the authority of capital R readiness can stop. And that's what makes it wonderful.
Yeah, and but I also want to like pin down one other thing that I think gets kind of lost in these questions of specifically of how we talk about romance, because part of this too is about the deployment of sex, right? It's about sex as sort of a history of practices and how it's distributed. Part of this is very eugenic too. It's about human capital, right? Unless you have $90,000 saved, et cetera, unless you have 10 years of fidelity IRA, et cetera, you're not ready to have a family or something like that. This is largely the logic that comes out of a very racist, racialized post Moynihan report world. Now, this goes back to the mid 60s with the birth of and the expansion of the notion of human capital. I mean, it's biopolitical too. And this is more than just about the reproduction of labor, but it cuts much deeper into questions of, as our stranger here has talked about, optimization. If Acid Horizon were to write a sequel to Anti-Oculus that played with the original term, it would be something like Anti-Optimus. I mean, it would be against optimization, right? Because I think that tends to be one of the things that produces a kind of anxiety among at least the three of us as authors, is this search for a metaphysics of refinement of human life rather than seeking an escape from that which does us harm and that which does our friends harm. And part of what makes this sort of so scary, even though we laugh at it when we see it, right? Like, look at this silly self-help guru that's got 10 million followers telling you shouldn't date a girl if she doesn't have $1 billion. There is Foucault writes off the importance of like self-help garbage in California, but there does have to be a critical account of the explosion of these texts and the function that they have in disciplining a society that's seeking the perfection of its own position within a given sort of subject function. And I think that's one of the tragedies, is that as soon as love becomes an institution, anything meaningful has already turned away and evaporated. And I think that's part of why I love the story about, I got a B minus or a C plus on the Will She Love Me exam, and we don't have everything in common. I think that the reality is that that's precisely how we have to come to understand love. And that's not just to be in valorization of some sort of ineffable force or something like that, some sort of deeper vitality. It's not that. But instead, love really is like, this is going to tick off all of the right-wing Marxist types that have been hounding us for days. Love really is a question of communism in that sense, in that it is absolutely fundamentally juxtaposed as a practice from all of the various metaphysical presuppositions of the post-industrial mode of production. And, I think for that reason, that's why it's so challenging to talk about love if one puts political programmatics at the front of their interests.
I saw, and we can cut this out if we don't want to talk about this, but some internet kind of LARPer type Leninist posted something about like sex is unnecessary and blah, blah, blah. And you were like, if this is how the program's going to be, it's going to burn. And I saw that. I typed out a comment and then I deleted it because I was like, oh, whatever, but, it's, if your political program doesn't account for the things that people just want to do, it's just not going to work. And what I mean by that is like, so many people have like these rigid political theories of like, this is how it'll work when the regime comes about. And then it's just so easy to be like, yeah, well, that just won't work for like a large population of the world. Actually, it might not even work for a small population of the world, and those people still exist. So you need to kind of figure out how the program's going to work for them too. And if your program's answer to that is, we just won't worry about those people, that's probably not communist. Not that I'm an expert on that. I'm actually just learning a lot from Twitter and you guys on that stuff, but it's probably not going to work. Like, unless you're really devoted to splitting populations up, and then you get into right-wing stuff or anarcho capitalist type stuff. And this is an interesting part where we won't talk too much about him, but Nick Land does say that like all soft fascism just leads to hard fascism, because you can't take a half measure when you're being a fascist. You have to go the full way. So if you're not genociding the people that you don't like, they're just going to be like, hey, why aren't we involved in the program? We want in, or we want our own state. And then the fear is, and this is almost Hobbesian, I know there's a lot of problems with Hobbes, but like, if we give the people who are excluded their own state, there's always that paranoia, that fascist paranoia that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, of like, what happens if they get powerful enough to question our authority and they come for our stuff, And so I think there's a very interesting like history and giant important message in what you said there, Will, of like, a political program only works if it applies to everyone. And that might sound like an impossible question or an impossible something, but that is the project almost, in a way.
But that's why politics is an art and not, it can't, there is a necessary impossibility of the political, but it comes down to the decision to act. And, that tweet that you're referencing about how like there's excessive sex and, it's a remarkable kind of tell about the threat that just modes of life and modes of existence that aren't immediately congruent with a political program, and first of all, none ever are, always threaten its destruction. So it will burn.
This is really great, because actually what we're saying almost is like exposing the fact that like readiness discourse is almost like a political program or narrative in itself. And that like you just said, any like reified political narrative is just going to be that. It's not really going to fit the real world we're operating in real time and in imminent bodies that are wanting things. Yeah. And that's like the problem of will or desire. I know, again, those are different concepts, but I think in the end, they almost have the same effect. Like, again, in mental health, we look at willingness versus willfulness. And like, we can do everything in the world, and a kid or a family can just say, nah, I'm not going to do that. Just like with like politics, right? You could be like, here's the case why we should do all these things and it'd be great. And you got someone in the back that goes, nope. And you could be like, well, here's why it would be helpful to you. No, I'm not going to do that. And that's like willfulness. And anyways, I won't get carried away, but there's something really important in there that I can't articulate in this moment, but it's got my gears turning for sure.
I mean, maybe another way to think about it, going back to what Will said about divisuality. And when we think about readiness, I think attendant to this concept of readiness is the self-splitting that not only we autonomously engage in, but also that which is valorized socially. And the concatenation of these categories, these thresholds through which our lives are to be lived, presupposes in the last instance something that needs to be excluded from all of that in order for the operation to move smoothly. And I mean, this goes right to the heart of something that Nietzsche writes about, something that we address in our book a little bit too, which is the notion of divisuality, or what he calls dividuum. And, as you said, with the fascists, they have to go all the way to the end, because not doing so gives those excluded or potentially excluded forces that exist outside of the acceptable polity, some leverage in the discourse that will then unsettle the program. So if you are to have a political program, and I mean, between me and Will, to say that we're extremely skeptical isn't going far enough. But at the same time, if you are going to have a political program, and if it cannot accommodate otherness, it's just going to fall apart ultimately. And I think what happens is, when you see eruptions of genocidal extermination and the sort of fascism that's bubbling up in the world, is you're seeing a loosening of the grip, in as much as you're seeing an attempt of that grip to be clamped down even further. It's because that control is being lost. And the new, in some sense, is being born. I believe anyway. That's what I would like to believe, but I think there is some factual evidence insofar as we see people who are, becoming radical and resisting in certain ways. Maybe it's not enough, but I do believe that it is certainly happening. Maybe you want to respond to that, but I have something else that I kind of want to go back to too. Maybe another little moment of personal disclosure. Given that I've been with my wife for 12 years, I mean, we're very open about everything, but it's interesting, and maybe you can relate, or maybe others who are listening can relate to this, but there's always that moment in long-term relationships where you reflect on the beginning of the relationship. Like, that becomes a sort of trope. It's really one of the most intimate things that you can do without having bodily contact, which is to sort of recount the origin and birth of your love. I often think too, it was very financially precarious for me at that time. And there were ways in those 10 to 12 years that I grew quite a bit. And it happened in the form of a monogamous marriage. And what that meant also was the convergence of our finances, our financial interests together, our financial outlook together. And something that's sad about that is that, like, the real moments of love happened almost in spite of those things. They were almost like a break or a breach from the sort of mutual strategizing that we had undertaken together. Like, how are we going to survive this? And it was almost when those things broke down or were at the point of failure that we could really find ourselves within it. And, just to kind of go back to the ironizing, it's funny because you sort of like trace this genealogy or lineage of like how each other has grown. To me, in the society that we live in, it's almost tragic that this is one of the only ways those kind of individual transformations can be realized meaningfully, is in the context of a marriage. And this takes us right back to anti-Oedipus. I would like to live in a world where that could happen in so many different ways. I mean, it has happened to me through friendships and like mentorships and that sort of thing. I've had that plethora of relationships that allowed me to grow in certain ways. But I think it's in the context of a marriage in particular that you're able to really feel the force of class pressures, of gender pressures, gender related pressures anyway, and that sort of thing, where you have to show up and be the man or something like that. Even though, that's usually not my shtick, but sometimes there's a conversation that needs to happen, and clearly there's a gendered element to the nudge, right? All of that to say is that amidst those pressures, there's this other sort of counterflow going on, where I think the real fruits of the relationship are being cultivated and harvested in some sense.
But it's very psychoanalytic in that when you get married, it's like you're introducing a third, which is the state, literally. Like, we don't even have to get symbolic. It's marriage is literally just like state sanctioned, like, you guys are now financially one entity and blah, blah, blah. But it also introduces all these other thirds in this like Oedipal triangle of like parent-in-laws, like having to be a certain way for them, because they're almost always, the way time works, from a different generation and have different values. So you have to be a certain way in front of these people. And, marriage brings with it a lot of systems that are there to judge and view you a certain way. And then love itself, whether it's in marriage or out of marriage, is like you said, in spite of everything reality wants to put on us, we're still going to choose to do this thing. That's like the power of the will to power. And it gets us to the eternal return of like choosing to do the same thing as if you were going to have to relive the decision for an infinitude of lives. And like, that's what all the cool love stories are about in film, are like, even if they're a little cheesy. Like another Wachowski siblings one was, oh no, I'm blanking on it. It got canceled because they did a lot of like cosmetic makeup that made the people look like different races, which is not okay, but it's still a good movie. What's that one called? But anyways, it's about how these lovers find each other through different epochs and time and space, and like no matter what, they always love each other no matter where they are, which is a cliche in poetry, but it is kind of what you're talking about a little bit. I can't remember the name of that film.
Yeah, it's would you still love me if I was a worm?
It's exactly that, and the answer is always yes.
Of course. And I think, like, I want to bring up just some of the criticism that some of these encampments have received. A family member of mine who is, a little bit more ironic with their politics, they tend to sort of think everything is a joke, sent me some list that a student encampment had, and they had the audacity to include condoms, as if that was a bridge too far. I find it fascinating how, there's a level of shock to the reality that people come together in these spaces and these sorts of relations occur, and the idea that this is something that's condemnable is fascinating to me. The idea that these momentous occasions where all of these students are sort of together, and I'm sure people are bringing their partners and everything, this idea that this wouldn't be sort of a moment where love is an organizing principle, right? Think about all of the ways in which students, when they're being arrested, link arms, right? There's a cohesion that for some reason eludes the conservative, who can only understand relations through contract, through obligation, through duty, through law, and never through ethics. And I think that's what was exposed by the desire to deeply laugh at this, that the preposterous nature that, like, people are having sex with their partner at night when they're in camping or something like that. So there's this absolute allergy to sort of accept that love is a political relationship, in that sense that it is truly political. And what I mean is that it's outside of parliamentary procedure. It is outside of the game of representation, as we've already talked about, right? So long as love is caught up in the face, caught up in representation, it's not love. So I think that, I don't have the same kind of 12-year 12-year relationship that Craig has. But I've learned in my life that the moment that love becomes a series of demands, that it's no longer existent. And that's what made that series of requests so upsetting, was that it wasn't just repartitioning the political. It's like, oh, here's a series of demands that you're going to deny, right? No, it's like, face the reality that we're a group of people who are existing in your face. A lot of these encampments are truly engaged in a sort of practice that is unintelligible to a lot of these administrators, because they're thinking, oh shit, we can't just capture them in the trap of an imbalanced power relation that becomes a discourse. Just to say, when we say, all power to the encampments, this includes, all my love to this project. If Benjamin says there is no unhappy love, and Marcello Tari says there is no unhappy revolution, then we have to understand that there is no unhappy sort of destituent gesture that presses against these institutions. Never reactively, right? Love is not a reactive repulsion to the institution. It simply elides it. And I think, like, for that reason, introducing all of these thirds, whether it's now the filial relationship that brings in all sorts of histories and debts, right? The way in which you sort of glide past these things is going to sort of be the challenge. And that's been a challenge, in my, not to get too personal, but in my life. I've had partners whose families are deeply ableist, and concerned about whether or not I can provide, things like that, right? Should have just told them, like, by the way, no, I'm doubling down on not providing. I'm a philosophy PhD, so. But yeah, no. So I think that your point about marriage as an institution providing this third apparatus, sort of this third person in the form of AB becomes AB, right? But this new unit is now the relationship itself as an institution, is precisely what you're always sort of skating by in love.
Oh, did you want to follow that up, stranger?
No, I'm just agreeing.
I'm trying to think if I left anything out of my saccharine reflections on my own marriage. There is something else that I wanted to go back to, on maybe on the point of readiness, and maybe it can even apply to romantic relationships and revolutions. I think there's a connection between the notion of readiness and the ability to put our claim on experience. And this is something that I just get a stronger sense for the older that I get. Friday as a day just comes around faster and faster every week, to the point where it's like I cannot catch time. I cannot even keep track of time. It seems like I'm just hurtling into the future. Death's door is getting closer and closer. And it's one of those things, especially like when I get busy, there's just particular weeks like, okay, this is going to be the busy week. And it's like, wow, it's here again. Friday is here again. And I don't get the sense that I have the power to grab on to time and to my experience and claim it as my own. And I think something about readiness does that too, in the sense that if we feel that we're ready, we can kind of time ourselves in a way. We can create little benchmarks. Maybe all of our points of readiness over our life are just photos in this grand scrapbook that is our lives. But at the same time, it's also tied into that aspect of ourselves that's able to claim meaning for ourselves, especially in the grand sense, because, looking back at my life from the time, for example, when I was a kid to a teenager to now, or maybe just looking back at the history of relationships, since that's something that we're talking about. I mean, in my life, I've probably had like 4 relationships that lasted longer than 3 years. And I was just thinking tonight, for the first time, like all of those relationships had very different vibes and functions and outcomes and ways that I metabolized everything that happened in there to form a sense of self. Like something very different happened in each one of those, to the point that they could not be equal to each other in any sense. And that's very weird. That's very weird, just thinking about that. And I'd almost want to like ponder that a little bit more, just as an exercise in masochism. But one of the great joys is to be able to go back and look at each one of those relationships and see that something very unusual, rare, and unique formed, as a particular image of myself. And that the subsequent image that formed in the wake of the other relationship or the other big event in my life also had an angle and a rarity to it that just made it so out, or just so different from the other one, that to be able to find the through line between those 4 particular relationships in itself is a kind of art of forming meaning. And, looking back on it, there's almost like a kind of pride or arrogance, like, because all of those images of myself stand before the me of who I am now. But at the same time, I don't think any one of those given relationships as monuments in my own life can be reduced to or account for the very immediacy that I'm experiencing myself right now, and the way in which I try to cling to those, fleeting moments that are passing by. And so one of the real art forms, I would say, at midlife, or at least, as I'm entering into midlife, is to be able to negotiate between that sort of meaning-making gesture of looking back on oneself, kind of incorporating and integrating, but also seeing the imminent reality that things aren't within your grasp. Everything's moving between your fingers, and it's happening with a pace and intensity. It automatically activates a sense of urgency if you start thinking about it. But at the same time, there is a kind of equanimity you can feel too, if you get yourself in the right headspace and heart space.
I'm going to share a reaction, and then I'm going to share a thought that totally contradicts probably everything I've said tonight. There's a Freudian concept for what you're describing. It's a long German word that I can't pronounce, but the translation is something like after effect or afterthought or after processing. And it's these moments we have in our life that psychoanalysis aims to simulate in the analysis situation that change the way we see our history, and then they changes the way we feel about ourselves in the moment, and then changes the way we act in the future. And for him, it's a very practical, like my example is when I realized, I told this dream like a few times ago, like when I realized that all the bullies who bullied me in high school kind of had like a reason to do it. It doesn't justify them at all, and I don't support bullying in any way or endorse it. But then I understand that I was probably an easy target for them. I was like this weirdo kid who like didn't go with the flow and like question things, and like I didn't fit in. So I could see how bullies would target me. Oh, now I understand that they're just doing what kids do sometimes, which is find the easy target and be mean to them. Does that make it right or moral or ethical? No. But does that help me understand where they're coming from without agreeing with it? Yes. Does that actually change the way I understand humans and understand myself? So on and so forth. And then there's been other moments. They say like your brain doesn't develop until you're 27. I'm not into the physicalist, reductionist type, stuff, because that is like right in line with the optimization bullshit that we're kind of criticizing here. But I will tell you, around 27, life started to seem a little clearer to me. And I think, Will, you even posted some post like a while ago that was like, when will this end? And I was like, around 27 to 32. I'm 32. I'm not afraid to age myself, but like around 27, 28, I really started to go, oh man, what was I doing? Oh gosh, I wouldn't do that now. That doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do back then, but like you get a different perspective that I can't explain, which is why Jungians say that you're not allowed to be an analyst till you're 31. And on the other side of the spectrum, Lacanians say you're allowed to be an analyst whenever the hell you want. There's no fucking test. You just decide when you want to be an analyst, and you tell the secretary who runs the patient portal in your institute, and they say you're good. So that's what Lacan did in France. He said there should be no test. Whoever wants to come to my school can just come and get in. There is no test to get in. You don't know you're ready to be an analyst until you think you're ready, and then you're ready enough. So there's these two extremes in analysis. I actually kind of think there's some merit to the Jungians when they're like, you shouldn't be an analyst till you're 31. You have to have some level of experience if you're going to guide people, but that's because they have a certain frame. I think there's actually some merit to this Lacanian approach of like the kind of Guattarian just fuck around and see what happens and abolish these weird rules and just let people explore their desire and help other people explore their desire. So I don't know if that enriches what you shared, Craig, but I think you're onto something, and it fits in that history of like the way authorities in analysis or psychiatry or in intellectual history like respond to criteria of readiness in an interesting way.
Revisiting my account of the past 47 years of my life, as I've spelled them out here just a few moments ago, there's a way in which the angularity of these monuments, this is the image that I'm putting forward, right? You have this desert. Like basically, we're all the poem Ozymandias, but we have multiple kings who have come to pass, right? And so here you have just like scattered granite limbs over the expanse of this desert and just detritus everywhere, just a trash heap. There's so much about our lives that was either banal or inane or like we're just very embarrassed by. But here's some proud accomplishments, and they stand as monuments, and some are a bit cracked, or what have you. And you just kind of take it all in, from any given vantage point at any moment in life. And depending on who it is and what it is you're focusing on at any given moment, one can feel proud or unsettled by any given perspective that they take in looking at this sort of massive monuments and detritus. To be able to pull together these disparate fragments and then make some semblance of meaning, to bring it all together, is something that no one with any authority is going to be able to do for you in the end. Like even the most skilled psychoanalyst is going to have to sort of like give up the analysis and give them back to themselves so that that person can either make a claim for that grander meaning, which once again comes with the proviso that time is evanescent and everything is coming to pass. And so even the claim that we're making gets washed into the sea of temporality. Like I said, in the last instance, no one can have an authority, even I as the subject who's experiencing that. And to me, that's kind of a testament to the very flawed or wobbly basis of subjectivity with a capital S. And so I think if you're doing any form of psychoanalysis or doing any kind of groups or things like that, we have to pay homage to, or at least acknowledge, in some significant way that any of the sort of bases for a practice or sense of shared meanings always is going to be porous or perforated in some sense. And that no authority in the last instance is going to be able to overcode the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's what Deleuze and Guattari's project is like. Basically, like, Freud started to get it right by exploring all the like frayed ends of subjectivity and all the holes and all the weird stuff. And then he kind of like cleaned up the mess because he needed to make a science of it all to make some money to marry his wife. Like that's kind of the narrative of Freud. And he also wanted to appease his superiors and, be like a cool guy that founded a new science. And then, Guattari and Deleuze are like, look at all this like crazy stuff that we could explore and make something interesting of if we didn't just go to like, oh, it's all just daddy mommy in the end. And again, everyone says that's a polemic, but they actually say in the book, we're critiquing the epistemology of psychoanalysis, because if your theory always ends in the same answer, it's not a very helpful theory for understanding things. Like if the answer is already decided at the start, you don't need a theory. That's religion. God did it all. So that's, it's actually a really strong epistemological critique of like why we use theory.
That's important because a very similar narrative or a similar account can be made of Carl Jung too. It wasn't until quite recently that we had access to the Red Book. If you don't know the story of the Red Book, essentially Carl Jung's autoanalysis was undertaken in a series of writings where he engaged in prolonged active imagination, which he recorded in something called the Red Book, and that was never to be published alongside the copious amount of psychological / scientific work that Carl Jung had done. And there's different kinds of Jungians out there, but when you look at Jung's work in the Red Book, a lot of what happens there, it's not that it necessarily contradicts his making scientific of his endeavors, but in a way it also does, because what he's accessing and what he's engaging is a very personal set of intuitions, and he's basically drinking directly from the font of imagination. And it just seemed such an interesting choice for him at the end of his life to say not to publish these works. Now it's widely available to anyone. My friend had bought me like the big $125 illustrated version. Yeah, you can get like a $30 like faux leather one out there that's just the text. But even if you're not like a big fan of Carl Jung, and anybody who's read my work knows that I'm ambivalent about him. But anyway, back to my original point is that there is a kind of split intellectually, methodologically, and perhaps we could say even at the level of being an individuated person. He did not allow, at least in the realm of publishing, those discourses to come together. And I find that choice interesting. And I think, and Deleuze and Guattari didn't have access to that in their critiques of Jung. And it would be interesting to go back to, for example, like 1,000 Plateaus, the Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal plateau, where they really like talk about Carl Jung and Bachelard and that stuff, to see like how the Red Book would have maybe changed the mind of Deleuze, who I knew was a big fan of Jung in his youth. But anyway, that's interesting, is that, the most famous of psychoanalysts have these sort of shadows within their own works, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari were confronting with schizoanalysis. But
when we talk about coding and overcoding, and we talk about the dictatorship of the image, Craig's work sort of, I think, necessitates a kind of encounter with love, precisely because I think love is the perpetual shedding of sort of predicates. I am not, a teaching assistant in logic. I am not, PhD student or things like that. In this, I think, when we say love resists, it's just because it's resisting a kind of overcoding. And I think that, to bring sort of the question of readiness and the question of threshold back into the discussion, I think that if your understanding of love is that an amorous threshold must be met, I think that you've allowed love to fall into psychology, or at least into a certain kind of qualitative account of what we might call the experience or the violence of thought. And, when we say things like, love is faceless, like the Los Guitari say, or that we say that, like Tari says, love is the dissolution of uh, the ego, right? But I think that in a certain sense, these sorts of movements that we take with one another are questions of our ability to take on a certain form of life. Like loving someone is recognizing that their life is at stake in their form and who they are, their happiness. Nothing. Loving someone is understanding that what is at stake in their existence and their way of existing is their happiness. Love, and that doesn't mean that you don't grow and become better or whatever, but it is understanding that a human being is not a series of refinable operations or specific qualities. I'm thinking of, when we try to define love in this way, I'm thinking of Diogenes breaking into the agora and saying, aha, I found Plato's man. It's the defeathered chicken. Love will always fail these kind of definitions, which is why any given sort of epoch like ours of the commodity, it's taking the form of commodity relations, of human capital. Because it's so hard to define, we just say, oh, fuck it. It's an investment. It's an investment of time. If your relationship failed, that was a lost investment of time. So the challenge of ethics, which I think is also the challenge of communism, is to be able to love, devoid of any dogmatic image of thought or any given dictatorship of a metaphysical epoch. I think that that's the real challenge, which is why love is never definable, because it's always in a sort of a state of 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 escape. So I think that for that reason, it remain like what remains to be sort of dismantled, if what we want to do is sort of engage with love at the level of an ethics, is to do the very thing that uh, Craig is trying to do, which is to sort of dismantle uh, these apparatuses, whether they be disciplinary or uh, economic or and so on, that produce particular dogmatic images of thought. Because I think the way in which we perceive ourselves and the way in which we tell ourselves we think is always going to sort of determine the way in which we tell ourselves we love. So, yeah, I think that's the challenge. The challenge of love is the challenge of communism.
Yeah, I think one of the least loving things you can do is, and this is what a lot of psychoanalysis is about, if you're doing good psychoanalysis, is like seeing someone else in a particular way and not being able to adjust that way of seeing them. So and usually you're seeing your own deficit. I use that kind of in mock quotes again, because I don't want to reify this own optimization narrative we're trying to deconstruct, but people see their own deficits in others. I had a patient years ago, many, many years ago, and I'm going to change the story a little bit so it's not identifiable, but they had a dream all the time where a parent would buy them a thing that the kid knew, the parent knew they didn't like. So they would get them a food item that they didn't like. And the parent would always be like, aren't you grateful? And the kid would be like, no. And this was their real life experience with the mom, with the parent all the time, who would get them a gift, but it was more of a gift for the parent than it was the kid. And I think we've all done that by accident. Like, the joke is like the stupid man buys the woman the Xbox and is like, isn't this what you wanted? And it's what he wanted, right? So the least loving thing you can do, because I'm trying to articulate what we're finding so hard to articulate about love in a negative frame of like, the least loving thing you can do is have an image ahead of time that is not adjustable with feedback, and you're just like projecting it onto everyone. So getting a gift, and Lacan talks about that. I don't like Lacan much, but it's one of the things he does well, where he talks about getting someone a gift that they didn't ask for is one of the most aggressive things you can actually do. And your patients will do that. Like I don't do so much analysis anymore, but when I had people come in and lay on the couch and blah, 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 and then like they bring me a gift and it's like, you don't know anything about me. Like, you don't know that I like this fragrance of candle. Like, it's nice that you thought of that, but like, I hate this actually. Like I would never say that because that's mean, but when we get people things that they don't ask for and we assume they're going to like it, on the one hand, it's really nice. On the other hand, it's kind of got an aggressive undertone. And I just think that's a breakdown. That's an obstacle to love often, I think. And it's bound up with commodity fetishism, gifts,
And this is part of the failure that's so important in Proust, where, we think of the kiss of Albertine, right? And it's dissolved into these very specific particularities, right? I think Deleuze and Guattari talk about it in either A Thousand Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus. But then at the same time, the cruelty of the narrator and the cruelty of the story is, on the one hand, you've got sexual encounters that are not necessarily sexual encounters, romantic encounters that are remarkably particularized. And then on the other, you have the imposition of the necessity of a particular way of being, you will be this person that plays Xbox. You will be the boyfriend that likes the lavender candle. And if you're not, so I think that in a certain sense that's a really sort of great example. It's like in the ethics of just coexisting is sort of demanding a particular behavior from perhaps from the get-go.
I don't know about you guys, but I am powering down, and tomorrow at 6:30 in the morning, they are opening a massive thousands of books book fair here, used books. So I do not need any more books, but I am fucking getting books tomorrow because they'll be $1 or $2 or $3 each. And I'm probably just going to buy like 6 copies of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. You know how it goes. There's nothing there for me. There's probably one book there for me, and somebody's already eyeballing it. Like the person who works there is going to buy it tomorrow. But I love digging in the crates for the books. So yeah, that's fun. But Stranger, we'll have you back again sometime, in a couple months, and we'll wax poetic on something else or discuss the current state of affairs, insofar as there is a world within which to discuss those things. So happy to have both you and Will here tonight.
I was so glad that you were here, Will. I guess that's it. Sounded like there was more of that, but there's not. Well, sounds good. Thanks for having me. And have me back at some point, because I like talking with you folks. So
yeah, people like the episode. I don't know if you've made it this far, which some of you will. Just shout us out. I never do this. I always say subscribe to the Patreon, but go on and overcome the negative reviews, particularly those calling for my death. I would like you to go put a 5-star review. I'm imagining if you've made it this far, you don't want me dead. So if you are that person, log on to Apple or wherever the fuck you put the 5 stars and click now, Acid Horizon.